If they truly didn't care, they wouldn't still be reacting to your silence. Indifference doesn't stalk. Indifference doesn't spiral. Indifference doesn't ache. Here's the truth. Most people get wrong. Narcissists don't forget you. They feel your absence every single day, but not in the way you felt the relationship. If this resonates, pause for a moment, take a breath, and if you're rebuilding after narcissistic harm, stay here. Because understanding this isn't about them anymore, it's about reclaiming your power and your clarity. A narcissist experiences your absence primarily as a loss of control rather than a loss rooted in emotional attachment. Control for them is the mechanism that keeps their inner world stable. When you were present, your reactions, availability, empathy, and predictability gave them a sense of dominance over the emotional environment. They knew how to provoke you, soothe themselves through you, or extract validation when their self-image wavered. Your presence allowed them to regulate their mood, self-worth, and identity without having to develop those capacities internally. When you leave, that system collapses. What disappears is not just a person, but the assurance that they can still influence, access, or shape you. This loss registers as a threat, not as grief in the healthy sense, but as destabilization. Without control, narcissists feel exposed. Your absence removes a familiar emotional lever, and that creates discomfort they cannot easily name. They may feel irritated, restless, or agitated without understanding why. This is because control gave them certainty. Knowing they could pull you back, provoke a response, or occupy space in your mind reassured them of their importance. Once you are gone, especially if you disengage silently, that reassurance evaporates. The silence is not neutral to them. It becomes evidence that they no longer dictate the emotional terms of the relationship. This can trigger obsession, resentment, or compulsive rumination, not because of love, but because control once equaled safety. They may rewrite the narrative to protect their ego, telling themselves they discarded you or that you were insignificant. But this story must be constantly reinforced because reality keeps intruding. Reality shows up when they feel compelled to check your status, mention you unexpectedly, or compare their current circumstances to what existed when you were there. These behaviors are attempts to reclaim psychological control in the absence of real access. Even anger can be a substitute for control because emotional charge still creates a sense of connection. What they struggle with most is not missing you as a person, but confronting the fact that you removed yourself from their influence, disrupting a dynamic they relied on to feel powerful, secure, and intact. Silence activates one of the deepest fears a narcissist carries: the possibility of being replaceable. While they project superiority and confidence, their self-worth is fragile and externally constructed. It depends heavily on attention, relevance, and the belief that they are central in other people's emotional worlds. When you go silent, you remove the feedback loop that reassures them of that importance. Silence doesn't argue, defend, or chase. It offers no proof that they still matter. This absence of reaction is experienced as a psychological void, and that void quickly fills with anxiety rather than indifference. Your silence forces them into a position they avoid at all costs: uncertainty. When you were reactive, even in pain, they could interpret your responses as evidence of impact. Anger, tears, explanations, or attempts to be understood all reinforce the idea that they were still significant. Silence removes that confirmation. It leaves them wondering whether you have emotionally detached, whether someone else has taken their place, or whether they were ever as essential as they believed. For a narcissist, being replaced is not just a relational fear, but an existential one, because their identity is built on being special, superior, and irreplaceable. This is why silence often provokes intensified behaviors. They may attempt indirect contact, provoke reactions through others, or suddenly resurface with exaggerated confidence or performative happiness. These are not signs of moving on, but of testing relevance. They are attempts to see if they can still elicit curiosity, jealousy, or emotional disturbance. Even negative reactions can temporarily soothe the fear of being forgotten. Without reaction, their mind begins to spiral, replaying interactions and searching for signs they were still valued. Silence becomes a mirror reflecting the possibility that they were not indispensable after all. What makes silence especially destabilizing is that it denies them the ability to control the narrative in real time. They cannot correct your perception, dominate the emotional space, or reassert superiority. Instead, they are left alone with an image of themselves that is no longer being actively validated. This is deeply uncomfortable because it exposes how dependent their sense of worth is on others. Silence doesn't punish them intentionally, but it confronts them with a reality they try desperately to avoid: that their importance is not guaranteed, and that someone can leave, detach, and continue without them. A narcissist relies on external sources to stabilize their sense of self because their identity is not internally cohesive. Rather than having a consistent inner core, they regulate who they are through the reactions, admiration, compliance, or emotional availability of others. When you were in their life, your presence served as a daily point of reference that helped them feel grounded, superior, or justified in their self-image. Your responses confirmed who they believed themselves to be. When you leave, that external anchor is removed, and the disruption is immediate and ongoing. Your absence is not simply noticed, it destabilizes how they experience themselves. Without your emotional input, their identity regulation begins to falter. They may feel unusually empty, agitated, or disconnected because there is no longer a familiar source reflecting their importance or authority. This can manifest as mood swings, impulsive behavior, or an increased need for attention from others. They are not responding to loss in a reflective or emotionally integrated way, but to a break in a psychological system that once functioned smoothly. You were part of the structure that helped them maintain equilibrium, even if that role came at great cost to you. When that structure collapses, they are left scrambling to reconstruct it elsewhere. They may also idealize or devalue you in retrospect as a way to manage the destabilization. Idealizing preserves the fantasy of control, while devaluing protects the ego from acknowledging dependence. Both are attempts to restore balance. At its core, the daily impact of your absence lies in how it forces them to confront a fragmented sense of self without the familiar external support that once helped hold it together. The discomfort persists not because they miss the relationship, but because the internal structure that relied on your presence no longer functions as it once did. When a narcissist feels your absence on a daily basis, it rarely shows up as visible sadness or longing. Instead, it manifests as chronic irritation, restlessness, and a vague sense of dissatisfaction that they struggle to explain. These emotional states are signals of internal dysregulation. Your presence once helped stabilize their mood and self-perception, even if the relationship itself was chaotic. Without that stabilizing influence, their emotional baseline shifts. They may wake up feeling unsettled, easily annoyed, or emotionally flat because the internal mechanisms that kept them soothed are no longer being supported externally. Restlessness becomes a common experience because stillness allows awareness, and awareness threatens the fragile self-image they work hard to maintain. Your absence removes a familiar distraction, leaving them alone with internal tension they do not know how to process. This is why they may overwork, overindulge, or compulsively seek stimulation through social media, attention, or conflict. These behaviors are not random. They are attempts to escape the discomfort that surfaces when the emotional regulation you once provided is gone. Even moments of apparent success or pleasure can feel incomplete because they lack the emotional reinforcement they were accustomed to receiving. Compulsive checking is another way this discomfort expresses itself. They may monitor your online presence, ask about you indirectly, or replay old interactions in their mind. This is not driven by nostalgia or remorse, but by a need to restore a sense of control and familiarity. Checking becomes a ritual that temporarily soothes anxiety by reaffirming connection, even if that connection is imagined. Each check is an attempt to reduce the unease created by not knowing how you see them now or whether they still occupy space in your mind. What makes these daily reactions persistent is that they are not resolved by time alone. Irritation, restlessness, and checking behaviors continue because the underlying issue remains unaddressed. They have lost a source of emotional regulation and cannot easily replace it with internal stability. As a result, your absence becomes woven into their daily emotional experience, not as conscious grief, but as a low-level agitation that follows them through routines, relationships, and quiet moments, reminding them repeatedly of a disruption they cannot fully control or repair. When a narcissist replaces you quickly, it often creates the illusion that you were easily forgotten and fully interchangeable. In reality, new supply functions more like a temporary anesthetic than a cure. It provides a short-term boost of attention, admiration, and novelty, which helps stabilize their self-image on the surface. However, the wound created by your absence operates at a deeper psychological level. You were not just a source of validation, but a familiar regulator of their emotional world. New supply lacks the shared history, attunement, and predictable responses that once allowed them to feel anchored. As a result, the relief they experience is shallow and unstable. The presence of new supply often intensifies comparison rather than erasing the past. They unconsciously measure new reactions against what they received from you, especially if you were emotionally invested, empathic, or consistent. When the new person fails to mirror them in the same way or does not provide the same level of emotional labor, irritation and dissatisfaction emerge. This is not because the new supply is inadequate, but because the role you played cannot be seamlessly transferred. Each failed attempt at replication reminds them of the gap you left, reinforcing the wound rather than closing it. This is why narcissists may cycle rapidly between idealization and devaluation in new relationships. The initial excitement masks the discomfort briefly, but once novelty fades, the underlying dysregulation resurfaces. They may then seek additional sources of attention, escalate demands, or provoke conflict to extract reassurance. These behaviors signal that the internal imbalance remains unresolved. New supply becomes a tool to avoid confronting loss, not a solution that heals it. Your absence also lingers because it represents a loss of certainty. You were a known quantity, someone whose responses and emotional availability were familiar. New supply introduces unpredictability, which destabilizes rather than soothes them over time. Even when they appear outwardly happy or performatively fulfilled, the internal comparison continues. The wound persists because it is tied not just to losing attention, but to losing a specific form of regulation that cannot be recreated on demand. New supply may distract, but it does not restore the sense of control, familiarity, and emotional leverage that once made them feel internally secure. Narcissists often replay past interactions in their minds as a way to mentally reassert dominance after losing real-world access to you. These mental rehearsals are not rooted in longing or emotional processing, but in an attempt to restore a sense of power that was disrupted when you left. When you were present, control could be exercised through words, reactions, and emotional influence. Once that control is gone, memory becomes a substitute arena where they can still feel superior, justified, or in charge. Replaying conversations allows them to imagine different outcomes in which they regain the upper hand or reaffirm their importance. This mental looping serves an ego-protective function. It allows them to reinterpret events in a way that preserves their self-image and avoids confronting vulnerability. In these imagined scenarios, they may cast themselves as the one who rejected you, dominated the situation, or remained emotionally unaffected. This rewriting helps counter the discomfort of reality, which is that you chose to leave or disengage. The more destabilizing your absence is, the more frequently these mental replays can occur, because the mind is attempting to repair a perceived injury to status and control. Replaying interactions also helps them maintain a psychological connection. Even negative or conflict-laden memories can feel preferable to emotional disconnection. The act of thinking about you keeps you mentally present, which temporarily reduces the anxiety created by your absence. This is not about missing shared intimacy, but about maintaining relevance and influence in their internal world. As long as they are still engaging with you mentally, the loss feels less absolute. These replays often focus on moments where they felt challenged, exposed, or contradicted. Those moments threaten their self-concept and demand ongoing mental correction. By revisiting them, they attempt to neutralize shame or self-doubt by reframing the interaction in their favor. However, this process is never fully satisfying because imagined control cannot replace actual influence. The need to replay persists, creating a cycle where the mind returns repeatedly to unresolved scenes. Over time, this mental rehearsal becomes part of how they cope with the disruption caused by your absence. It is a way to avoid integrating the reality of loss while still trying to preserve dominance internally. Rather than processing emotions and adapting, they remain psychologically entangled, using memory as a stage to reenact control they no longer possess in real life. When you begin to heal, grow, and reclaim your life, it creates a unique threat to a narcissist that goes far beyond the pain of separation. Your healing directly contradicts the narrative they rely on to protect their ego. Narcissists maintain a sense of superiority by framing themselves as the center of meaning, influence, and emotional gravity. When you were with them, your struggles, confusion, or emotional investment reinforced that story. Once you step away and begin to stabilize, their internal logic is disrupted. Your improvement suggests that they were not essential to your functioning, and that idea is deeply unsettling. Your healing also exposes the limits of their power. Narcissists often believe that their presence defines others, either by elevating or diminishing them. When you thrive without them, it challenges the belief that they had a lasting hold over you. This is not something they can easily dismiss, because it undermines the role they assigned themselves in your life. Your progress becomes a silent statement that you were not broken, dependent, or incapable, but simply constrained by the dynamic. This realization threatens their sense of dominance and can provoke resentment, dismissal, or attempts to minimize your growth. What intensifies this reaction is that your healing happens quietly and internally. You no longer need validation, explanations, or closure from them. This absence of engagement removes opportunities for them to reassert relevance. They may attempt to reframe your growth as fake, temporary, or driven by spite, because acknowledging genuine healing would require admitting that their influence was not as profound as they believed. Denial becomes a defense against that uncomfortable truth.